In a peaceful Italian town, neighbors were jolted awake by the desperate screams of a man standing outside his own home in the middle of the night. He begged them to call the police. He kept saying something terrible had happened inside. When the emergency line answered, he was told to go back inside and check if his wife and children were still breathing. He refused. He said he could not bring himself to touch their bodies. He explained he had been out watching Italy play England in the World Cup with friends, and that everything had seemed completely normal when he left home hours earlier. But when officers finally entered that house, they found a scene that would haunt them for years. A mother and her two small children dead inside their own beds. At first, it looked like the work of a violent intruder who broke in and vanished without a trace. But within days, investigators would discover something far more disturbing hiding beneath the surface of the seemingly perfect family. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the house is the one holding everyone else while they cry. Drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from. And if you are new here, go ahead and subscribe. To understand how a seemingly loving husband and father became the center of one of Italy's most chilling murder cases, we have to go back and meet the woman whose life would eventually be cut short by the very person she trusted most. Cristina Omes was born in September of 1975 in the northern Italian city of Pavia, the eldest daughter in her family, and from a very young age she carried herself with a kind of quiet strength that people noticed immediately. She loved to lead. She organized activities among her classmates and consistently pushed herself to excel both in her studies and on stage in school. Theater productions. Her natural charisma made it easy for her to build friendships, and even as a teenager, she had a presence that made people remember her. After finishing high school, she was accepted into a respected university in Milan and left her parents' home to begin an entirely new chapter of her life. Yet even living independently, she never drifted from her family, staying in close contact with her parents and making a point to visit whenever she could. While she was still studying, she landed a position at a prominent insurance company based in the town of Motta Visconti, and her talent did not go unnoticed. Within just a few years, she had earned a series of promotions that made her one of the most respected professionals at the company. She could have easily pursued a bigger career in a major city once she graduated, but Christina chose to stay close to the town and the roots that meant so much to her, valuing stability, family, and quality of life over ambition alone. Despite her professional success, she never let go of her true passion, which was theater, and on weekends, she devoted herself to rehearsals and musical performances. She had a striking voice and a commanding stage presence that eventually made her something of a familiar face throughout the region, with people occasionally recognizing her on the street after a show. But while her career and creative life flourished, her romantic life told a very different story. Christina had dated a few men over the years, but none of them matched the future she quietly imagined for herself. Many of the men she met lacked maturity or simply did not share her desire to build a family, and yet she held on to the belief that she would eventually find someone to share her life with. That moment came when she least expected it, and his name was Carlo Lissi. Handsome, polite, and outwardly reserved, Carlo seemed like a completely different kind of man from anyone she had dated before. Intelligent, quiet, and holding a good job, he appeared to be exactly the kind of partner she had always hoped to find. What Christina could not yet know was that behind that calm exterior were traits that would remain hidden for years. Traits that would one day turn her seemingly perfect family into the center of one of the most shocking crimes in Italy. But to understand how everything reached that terrible point, we need to go back even further and learn about the childhood and personality of the man she fell in love with. Carlo Lissi was born in the autumn of 1982 in the town of Casarano, the eldest son in a traditional household shaped by strict discipline and very little outward affection. His father had a reputation for being authoritarian at home, where decisions were rarely questioned, and any hint of disobedience was met with harsh criticism. While his younger brother received more warmth and attention, Carlo spent his childhood trying desperately to earn his father's approval, and from an early age, he learned to push his own wants aside. Though he genuinely loved football, he was steered into volleyball simply because that was what his father wanted for him, and he faced constant pressure to perform academically and to pursue a career path his family considered respectable. Over time, Carlo grew into a reserved and insecure young man who avoided conflict whenever possible and preferred agreeing with people rather than risking disappointing them. At school, he had few friends and was sometimes the target of teasing from classmates, without ever being able to stand up for himself. After finishing high school, he enrolled at a prestigious university to study economics, though the decision had nothing to do with any personal dream and everything to do with his father's expectations of stability and prestige. With little genuine enthusiasm for the subject, Carlo completed his degree anyway and landed a job at a major information technology company in Milan, where the salary was strong and his career looked promising on paper. Physically, he drew attention wherever he went. Tall, athletic, and always well-dressed, and his appearance combined with his education and calm demeanor made people trust him easily. But those who knew him more closely began to notice unusual patterns. He avoided questions that made him uncomfortable and had a real talent for changing the subject without ever seeming evasive. He also showed very little sensitivity toward other people's struggles, reacting with distance, even when friends or family were going through difficult times. His romantic life followed a similar pattern. Carlo entered relationships easily, but they rarely lasted long. As soon as a connection deepened, he would lose interest or avoid making any real commitment, preferring shallow relationships with no responsibilities or long-term plans attached. Even as a financially stable adult, he continued living with his parents for years, showing little drive to build an independent life of his own. Everything began to shift the moment he attended a theater performance starring Cristina Omes. On stage, she captured his attention instantly. Her confidence, her striking voice, and her powerful presence left him watching in fascination through the entire show. Despite his admiration, he did not have the courage to approach her that night. It was only a few weeks later, through mutual friends, that fate finally brought the two of them together. And what started as a simple conversation would soon set into motion a chain of events that no one around them could have ever predicted. The connection between them formed almost instantly once their mutual friends finally introduced them properly. Christina saw in Carlo an educated, intelligent, and seemingly gentle man, while Carlo found in her a confident, determined, and successful woman who represented everything his reserved personality was not. The age gap between them, she was 30 and he was 23, never became an obstacle for the couple. Christina had reached a point in her life where she wanted to build a family, and after dedicating so many years to her career, she believed she had finally found the right partner to build that future with. Carlo, on the other hand, seemed willing to follow her lead in every plan they made, and because she naturally had the stronger personality, Christina began guiding the relationship almost from the start, making most of the major decisions while Carlo agreed with nearly everything and rarely pushed back. To Christina, this behavior looked like calmness and maturity. She believed she had found someone steady and balanced, who was ready to build a life at her side. Not everyone around them shared that same impression, though. Christina's parents welcomed Carlo politely, but they carried real concerns. Her mother in particular saw him as emotionally immature, excessively dependent on the opinions of others, and lacking any real initiative of his own, believing her daughter deserved someone more secure and better prepared to face life's challenges. Christina, however, was convinced those insecurities would fade with time. Interestingly, Carlo's own family reacted in the exact opposite way, immediately approving of the relationship since Christina was successful, responsible, and represented exactly the kind of stability they had always hoped for their son. With at least partial approval from both families, the relationship moved forward quickly, and about a year later, Carlo and Cristina decided to move in together and begin planning their wedding. Everything seemed to be heading toward a happy future, but just days before the ceremony, something happened that would reveal a side of Carlo that Cristina had never seen before. Shortly before the wedding, Carlo attended his bachelor party organized by friends at a well-known nightclub in Milan, and the evening was filled with drinks, games, and celebration. At some point, a woman began showing interest in him, and encouraged by friends, who told him this was his last chance before married life. He made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. He left with her and spent the night at a hotel, and the next morning, caught up in the excitement of the moment, he even told the woman he was falling for her, and that he intended to call off the wedding. When he returned home, he decided to tell Cristina everything. The confession hit her like a shockwave, and after hearing it, she packed her bags and temporarily moved back into her parents' home, believing that this betrayal was clear proof that Carlo might never truly be ready for real commitment. When Carlo's father learned about the breakup, he reacted with intense anger, demanding that his son go find Cristina, immediately apologize, and do whatever it took to win her back. And having spent his whole life obeying his father, Carlo did exactly that, showing up at her parents' door with a large bouquet of flowers to beg for a second chance. Cristina's parents were completely against reconciliation, believing Carlo had shown nothing but immaturity and irresponsibility, and that their daughter deserved someone far more trustworthy. Despite their objections, Cristina made her own decision. After several days of reflection, she chose to forgive him, believing that people make mistakes and that a strong relationship could also be built through forgiveness and a willingness to begin again. And so the wedding went ahead as planned. With money received as gifts from family, the couple bought a home in Motta Visconti and began a new chapter of their life together. In the early years, everything appeared to run smoothly. Cristina kept advancing professionally at the insurance company, while Carlo built his career in information technology, and financially they lived comfortably, enjoying trips, outings, and family time together. In 2009, their daughter Giulia was born, and about 4 years later, in 2013, their son Gabriele arrived, completing what looked from the outside like a picture-perfect family. To friends, relatives, and neighbors, the Lissis represented pure happiness. Carlo appeared to be a devoted husband and an involved father, while Cristina believed she had finally built the life she had always dreamed of. But that image hid a completely different reality. During the week, Carlo commuted daily to Milan for work, and it was precisely while away from home that he began living a double life, pursuing relationships with other women he met in cafes, shopping centers, and simply walking around the city streets. Most of these encounters were short-lived. Carlo showed intense interest while the pursuit still felt like a challenge, but quickly lost enthusiasm the moment any relationship required real commitment or responsibility. Even while juggling multiple affairs, he made sure to maintain the appearance of a devoted husband in front of his wife, his children, and his friends, and whenever rumors about his infidelity surfaced, Cristina confronted him directly, only for Carlo to deny everything with striking calm. His composed demeanor and his ability to respond without showing any nervousness meant that most accusations went nowhere, allowing him to keep hiding his secret life for years. In 2013, shortly after Gabriele was born, Carlo once again began considering leaving his family entirely, having developed feelings for another woman and going as far as telling Cristina he wanted a divorce. She listened to him with remarkable composure, trying to make him reconsider by explaining how devastating a separation would be for their children and how deeply it would hurt his own parents, who had always dreamed of seeing their family stay together. Once again, Carlo abandoned the idea, not because his feelings had changed, but because facing the consequences of that decision felt harder than simply continuing a life he no longer wanted. On the surface, nothing seemed to change. At home, he kept playing the role of devoted husband and father, while internally his resentment quietly continued building. Then, in early 2014, a new colleague joined his workplace, and her arrival would push those feelings to a level far more dangerous than anything that came before. She was young, charismatic, and immediately caught Carlo's attention, and what started as simple interest would soon spiral into an obsession capable of changing that family's fate forever. Determined to win her over, Carlo began seeking her out, constantly showering her with compliments, offering small gifts, and repeatedly trying to convince her to go out with him after work. But his colleague made her position clear from the very beginning. She knew he was married and the father of 2 young children, and for that reason alone, she turned down every advance, insisting she had no interest in getting involved with a committed man. Rather than discouraging him, this rejection had the opposite effect. The more distance she kept, the more Carlo fed a growing fantasy that he could somehow start an entirely new life at her side. Slowly, the way he viewed his own family began to shift. The wife who had supported him for years now felt like an obstacle standing in his way. The children who had once been a source of pride in front of others had become, in his mind, responsibilities holding him back from the life he believed he deserved. Consumed by this obsession, Carlo brought up divorce once again, and Christina listened calmly but held firm, just as she always had, believing separation would destroy the emotional stability of their children and end the family they had spent years building together. Still convinced their problems could be worked through, she assumed. The conversation was over, but this time something inside Carlo had changed. Without telling her, he began secretly consulting family law attorneys, trying to understand exactly what a divorce would cost him, and the answers he received completely shattered his expectations. Beyond splitting the assets they had built during the marriage, he would also be required to pay ongoing child support, and the idea of losing part of his wealth while taking on new financial obligations was something he simply refused to accept. According to investigators, it was during this period that his thinking took a disturbing turn. Instead of pursuing any legal path forward, he began searching for criminal alternatives instead. Late at night, while Christina and the children slept upstairs, Carlo sat alone, browsing internet forums, looking for information on violent crimes, searching for details on hard-to-detect poisons, fatal injuries, and cases of murder that had never been solved. One particular case caught his attention more than any other, a robbery that had taken place right there in Motta Visconti, where the homeowner had been killed inside his own house and the people responsible were never identified. For investigators, looking back later, that unsolved case appeared to serve as a blueprint, and from that point forward, Carlo began imagining how he could recreate a similar scene, staging his own family's deaths to look like the tragic outcome of a home invasion. While this plan quietly took shape inside his mind, absolutely nobody around him noticed anything different. At work, he continued performing his job exactly as before. Among friends, he maintained the same relaxed, easygoing image he always had. At home, he behaved like an attentive husband and a devoted father. And it was precisely that appearance of total normalcy that would make everything so difficult for people to accept once the truth eventually came out. Then came Friday the 13th of June 2014. Carlo had taken the day off, and rather than staying away from his family, he made a point of spending the entire day by his wife and children's side. They visited an amusement park together, walked through a shopping center, and ended the evening having dinner at a well-known local cafe. Investigators would later come to believe none of this had happened by accident. According to prosecutors, Carlo deliberately chose busy public places so that as many people as possible would see the family together, reinforcing the image of a loving husband and a happy household. Just hours before the unthinkable happened, as evening fell, they all returned home, and Giulia and Gabriele were put to bed upstairs as usual. Once the children had fallen asleep, Carlo and Christina spent some time together in the living room. And afterward, Carlo told her he was heading out to meet friends and watch the match between Italy and England at a sports bar in town. Christina thought nothing of it, since this was simply part of their normal routine, and she stayed behind in the living room watching television, believing her husband had already left the house. But according to the investigation, Carlo never actually left that night. And while Christina sat there completely unaware of any danger, a plan he had spent weeks quietly building was about to reach its final and most horrifying stage. According to the reconstruction, investigators would later piece together Carlo waited until he was certain Christina believed he had already left the house before finally putting his plan into motion. She sat there watching television with no idea that anything was wrong, completely unaware of the danger just steps away. Carlo picked up a knife from the kitchen and attacked his wife inside their own home. Christina fought back as best she could, and during that struggle she managed to injure his hand, a detail that would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Despite her resistance, she did not survive the attack. Carlo then went upstairs to the second floor where Giulia and Gabriele were sleeping, and forensic examinations later confirmed the children were attacked while they were still asleep, with no indication they were ever aware of what had happened to their mother. Some neighbors later said they heard screaming coming from the house that night, but the silence returned so quickly afterward that nobody suspected a tragedy was unfolding, and no call was made to police at the time. With the killings complete, Carlo moved into the second phase of his plan, scattering objects around the house to simulate a burglary, rearranging furniture, and trying to eliminate anything that could tie him to the scene. He also cleaned some of the blood from the floor and showered in a bathroom located in the basement. But in his haste, he made critical mistakes. He put the same shirt back on that he had worn during the attack. Without realizing, small traces of blood remained on the fabric, and he improvised a bandage for the hand injury he suffered during the struggle with Christina, believing he would be able to explain the cut later. Once he finished staging the scene, he left the house and went to the sports bar, where his friends were already waiting to watch the match between Italy and England. And there he behaved completely normally, laughing, celebrating the goals, and drinking beer with friends without showing the slightest hint of nervousness. Everyone there would later say he seemed perfectly relaxed the entire night. Near the end of the game, he even sent his wife several text messages, commenting on the score, saying he would be home soon, and closing one message by telling her he loved her. Messages prosecutors would later argue were a deliberate part of the alibi he had spent the night building to make it look as though he had no idea what had happened at home. In the early hours of the morning, Carlo returned home, and just minutes later, neighbors were jolted awake by his desperate screaming as he ran out into the street begging for help and claiming he had found his wife and children dead. While waiting for police to arrive, the emergency dispatcher asked him to check whether any of them still showed signs of life and to begin resuscitation if possible. But Carlo refused to go back inside, insisting he could not bring himself to touch their bodies. At first, this reaction drew little suspicion, with many assuming he was simply in shock. But once investigators reviewed the full sequence of events, that response began to look very different. Another detail also raised concern. Even before the deaths had been officially confirmed, Carlo had already begun referring to his wife and children as bodies, as though he was certain from the very start that no one could be saved. When emergency crews finally arrived, they could only confirm that all 3 victims were gone. In his early interactions with police, Carlo appeared to display grief, but his behavior struck several investigators as unusual, crying without tears, shifting between moments of apparent desperation and long stretches of complete coldness, and struggling to reconstruct his own movements from that night in any consistent way. Suspicion deepened further when he revealed he had recorded himself on his own phone entering the house, insisting the footage would prove his innocence. But the strategy backfired completely. The recording showed he barely checked on the victims at all, rushing out toward the street, instead of attempting to help or racing upstairs to check on his children. On its own, this behavior would not have been enough to convict him, but it became one more piece in a growing pattern that investigators could no longer ignore. As forensic teams worked through the house piece by piece, the burglary theory began falling apart entirely. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere. Valuables, cash, and jewelry remained exactly where they should have been. The disorder throughout the house looked artificial, as though it had been created solely to imitate a break-in that never actually happened. With that discovery, the entire direction of the investigation shifted, and what had once looked like a robbery gone wrong was now being treated as a triple homicide committed by someone who knew the house intimately and had unrestricted access to it. Piece by piece, Carlo Lissi stopped being seen as the grieving surviving husband and became the primary suspect in the case. Forensic examiners found small bloodstains on the back of the shirt he had worn that night. A distribution investigator said was inconsistent with his version of events, and consistent instead with someone who had directly participated in the attacks. The cut on his hand raised further suspicion, and while Carlo claimed he injured himself while fleeing the house, experts concluded the wound matched an injury sustained during a physical struggle, exactly the kind that could occur if a victim tried to defend herself. Soon after, another critical piece of evidence surfaced when investigators found a bloodied cloth in the household trash, believed to have been used to wipe away evidence following the killings, along with bloodstains discovered on his underwear, further strengthening the case against him. At the same time, specialists analyzing his computer and internet browsing history uncovered searches conducted in the days and weeks leading up to the crime, searches related to committing murder, causing fatal injuries, hard-to-detect substances, and details about other homicide cases that had gone unsolved. Evidence investigators said proved this had never been an act of impulse, but a carefully planned crime. Even confronted with this evidence, Carlo continued insisting he was innocent, remaining cold and distant throughout questioning, speaking about his wife and children with strikingly little emotion. But as the weight of the evidence continued to build, his story eventually collapsed, and he abandoned denial altogether, confessing to the crime in a tone investigators described as unsettlingly calm, describing the planning and execution of the murders without showing any remorse. When asked to explain his motive, he said he felt trapped by the marriage and by the responsibilities of family life, insisting divorce was never a real option for him because of the assets he would lose and the financial obligations he would face, and stating he wanted to build a new life alongside the woman he had become obsessed with, viewing his wife and children as nothing more than obstacles standing between him and that goal. These statements caused enormous shock once made public. Court-appointed psychiatrists evaluated Carlo throughout the legal process and found traits consistent with psychopathy along with a profound lack of empathy, though they ultimately concluded he fully understood the nature of his actions and was entirely capable of being held criminally responsible for them. During the trial, friends, relatives, and co-workers testified, many saying they never imagined Carlo capable of a crime of this magnitude, describing him to those who only knew him casually as polite, calm, and devoted to his family. But for prosecutors, the evidence told a very different story, one built on planning, an attempt to cover his tracks, and a staged burglary designed to steer the investigation away from the truth. In January of 2015, Italian courts sentenced Carlo Lissi to life in prison, and he reportedly reacted to the verdict with visible indifference. He later attempted to appeal the conviction, but ultimately withdrew that appeal, stating he believed the outcome was unlikely to change. Not long after his son's conviction, Carlo's father died of a heart attack, and according to reports at the time, he never came to terms with the idea that the son he raised could be responsible for something this devastating. The case of Carlo Lissi remains one of the most shocking crimes in modern Italian history, remembered not only for the brutality of what happened that night, but for the chilling calculation behind the planning and the attempt to cover it all up afterward. It stands today as a haunting reminder that the greatest danger a family can face does not always come from a stranger outside the door. Sometimes it is hiding behind a familiar face inside the walls of their own home. So now it is your turn. After hearing everything that happened to Christina, Julia, and Gabriela, at what point do you believe Carlo stopped thinking about divorce and instead began planning something far more cruel? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this keep you coming back, make sure you are subscribed, because there are many more real cases just like this one waiting to be told right here.